Okay, so run a show for this first session. I'm going to talk for a bit, and then I'm going to, I think, ask a question, answer it, smoke bomb, leave, go to the airport, and then Brant is going to take over and run a panel for the rest of this, time. So we're going to do it live here. Okay. There are a lot of great presentations you'll see this afternoon. I was hoping to tee this up a little bit based on some of the stuff that I've been seeing over the past handful of months in particular, and sort of this is a bit of a kind of set of provocations, a call to action for how we should be really trying to aggressively evolve storytelling. So I'm going to tee this up, and then the real sort of meat of the panel is going to be talking about how storytelling can and should change over the next 5 years or so. So with that, I'm going to learn how to use a computer. Let's see, which arrow do this? I go that way, I go this way. There we go, okay. I've been doing technology for 30 years now, in case you can't tell from my inability to navigate a keyboard here. My name is Marc Lavallee. I'm a sort of longtime person at the intersection of journalism and technology. So I've worked at a variety of news organizations, in philanthropy a little bit, and now I am building my own stuff because we are in this Wild West moment, and it's very exciting. So we're going to talk about a little bit of sort of how we got here over the past 20 years or so. It's not necessarily a great story in terms of the evolution of media and journalism, and sort of what we can be learning from what audiences are doing, what they're telling us, and then what we can do about it to create experiences that are meaningful and useful to people going about their daily lives. So, there's, I think, this version of journalism of the past. I think a lot of people have been in the industry for a while. Think of this as imperfect as it is. When you look at like the composition of the people in this room, for instance, as the good old days, right? And I think a lot of us either have been in the industry for a while or are coming into the industry, are sort of like learning principles and ways of doing things that really come out of rooms that looked and smelled like this. The news industry was fortunate for a number of decades because most news organizations were basically monopolies who controlled the flow and production of information and had captive audiences, right? So if you wanted to know what was happening in your city, usually there'd be like a little bundle of information that would arrive on your doorstep in the morning, and that was basically what you had to work with. And from a profit perspective and from a quality of journalism perspective, it was great. However, this doesn't really exist anymore. When people were growing up and sort of going about their lives a couple of decades ago, they had to figure out how to use a newspaper, right? They had to figure out what a byline was, what a dateline was, what sections were and things like that. And there was a lot of that sort of acquired news literacy, media literacy, right? And I think now what we know is that, if anything, we have to adapt our formats to the way people consume information on the internet. And that's, I think, been this tricky journey for us, right? So if you look at the last 20 years or so, every couple of years something new will come along, right? And so then we have to sort of figure out how to react to them, right? How do we take advantage of the rise of mobile? How do we put our stories out on social media? How do we, this is formatted poorly, so we lost the last decade or so. It's down here. How do we deal with the rise of AI and things like that, right? And what's happened in a lot of these situations is that, we've tried to, as an industry, continue to make these incremental changes, even though in a lot of ways the gaps have continued to widen between sort of what people want and what we're able to provide. So going back a decade now, at the Times, there was this huge effort, this is about a year-long internal reporting project on how the Times was performing from an innovation perspective, right? And the feeling was, and I think this was reasonably accurate, was that the quality of the journalism was really high, right? The challenge was getting the journalism out to people was a place where the Times was really falling behind. And one of the things that this report did, which subsequently got leaked to BuzzFeed so everybody can read it, is it looked at what competitors were doing. An interesting thing about this was that the competitive set that the Times was really focused on were like other news organizations, right? So it was like, oh, the Washington Post is doing this, and BuzzFeed is doing that. It wasn't even really at the time looking at what we were seeing in terms of the rise at that point of independent, what we now call creators, other ways that people were finding and getting information, whether that was from Facebook groups about their local community and things like that, right? So even though it was tracking to show that there's a lot of catch-up work that the Times needed to do, it was in a lot of ways kind of myopic about who it was thinking about as other ways of people getting sort of answers to questions that they had, right? And in some ways that myopia has sort of continued to manifest in pretty much any chart that you see about the media and news industry over the last 20 years pretty much looks like this, right? It's like kind of just like down to the right. So this is where we're at now, the steady decline over the past several decades now in terms of overall trust in news. That number is now 28% of people, Americans, have a reasonably high trust in news. The only number that's going up on this chart reliably is the people who don't trust news at all. We can see the same thing in terms of like number of employed journalists, revenues to news organizations, things along those lines. As we start to look at the role of artificial intelligence over the next handful of years, most people think that there will be fewer journalism jobs over the next 20 years. Let's even sort of fast forward and talk about that over the next 5 to 10 years, right? So this is not a great trajectory. Some of the reasons behind that are, a lot of you are living this, right? I mean, there's a rise in news avoidance and news fatigue, I think what we're starting to see within the industry, which I think is a healthy conversation, is instead of assuming that audiences are the problem, starting to try to understand a bit more the why that's the case, right? And so when you look at the fact that most news is negative and it makes people not feel good about themselves, that it can be, feels like we're focused in too many sort of specific areas like around politics and things like that, that most people don't want to pay for this to be able to support quality journalism. We're starting to get to a point of trying to say, well, what if the folks who are news avoiders are right? What if our products kind of suck? And what if that's the case, what can we do about that? How can we make these things better, as opposed to just saying, oh, folks will kind of age into becoming news consumers, or they'll start to care about certain things, and then they'll sort of like come to us, right? We have to go to them. In this moment as well, there's even more that we are essentially competing against, right? So it's not just different news organizations competing for attention. We're competing with these different these changes in habits. We're competing in even more so today, not just with bad actors who want to pollute the space with misinformation, but I think with the rise of a lot of this, a lot of not great AI generated material, just slop that's just sloshing around in search results and things like that. And we're also dealing with the sort of this evolution of who's gatekeeping and mediating these experiences, right? This has sort of moved away from news organizations, and it's moved much more to platforms, right? So if you have a lot of your consumption happening and being determined by feeds and algorithms, maybe news pops in there somewhere, but that is an algorithm that's based on keeping you on a platform, not necessarily making you feel like you are informed about the world. When it comes to what we're seeing with AI experimentation, I think there's a good amount to be excited about, folks trying things that are really on the production end of things, right? It's about sort of, how can we produce journalism faster? How can we get more details, more source material to be able to work with? How can we summarize these things? And because we're trying to improve what it is that we already do, a lot of that work is pretty incremental. When you look at those overall trends, what I'm seeing and feeling is that there's a huge need to be looking at doing things that are more directly audience facing, and there's an imperative for us to be trying to do things that are more radically different than what we've been doing over the past 20 years. Going back to all of those shifts over the past couple of decades, every couple of years, when a new technology or capability would come along, in the past, generally what we've seen is people, whether they're inside the industry or kind of outside the industry, taking a stab at trying something new and different and seeing if it sticks, right? So this is 20 years ago now. back before there was actually an official Google Maps API. Some folks reverse engineered it, and this news developer, Adrian Holavati, put crime data on a map. This was groundbreaking at the time, right? This is now kind of table stakes for a lot of the types of things that we do. But it led to some hand-wringing and questions like, is this journalism, and all that kind of stuff. But it started to show how more types of things could be visualized and sort of make it easier for people to be able to find out what's happening in their neighborhood and things like that. Similarly, and I didn't put this in here just because the creator of Circa is here in the audience. I don't pander that much, but this was, I think, a really interesting exploration of what it meant to think of stories as more of these like living objects, and instead of it just being like, here's another 1,100 words, try to really atomize that and make it so that people could follow developments and have a better understanding of what somebody's already up to speed on with the story and what's new and incremental, as opposed to making them do all that extra work every single time that they went to a news website. Neither of these exist today, right? Generally, these kind of more radical innovations don't land in a way that is a sort of directly a permanent part of how we produce and consume news. But what they do is they change the conversation, and they, you can find descendants of these things all over, right? So the rise of data visualization on news deadlines, is something that really came out of these early mashups. The idea that there are at least 45 different masthead editors at the New York Times over the past decade who have taken credit for live coverage and making the Times be much more of a destination for live coverage. And at least 20 of those have reinvented a lot of the stuff that Circa did over a decade ago. And again, it's sort of every, kind of up until now, I feel like there's been one of these provocations that's existed for pretty much every sort of one of these evolutions, right? We're kind of missing that. So you put all this together, and the risk in this moment, but also the opportunity, is that there's so much energy in essentially like optimizing the formats and outputs of journalism that our audiences are telling us are increasingly irrelevant, right? So the last bit of this, for this section, is we are living in this moment with artificial intelligence where there's this increased acceleration, right? So there are some people who think that we're going to hit this sort of threshold of artificial general intelligence where this thing is just continuing to self-improve sometime in the next couple of years. We're seeing some of that kind of stuff happen with software development now. But whether or not this plays out the way that some people in Silicon Valley think it is, the two things that are important here are, one, that the space and the capabilities are evolving even faster, which makes it even more imperative for us to figure out what we can be doing here. And then also, if it's not just about trying to figure out what may happen over the next couple of years, the consequences of our information ecosystem changing even more rapidly are incredibly high stakes. So starting to think about what that means and how we deal with it is, in my view, incredibly important. This quote is a mantra from Jay Rosen. In this, he was talking about this in the context of the election cycle last year, right? That so much election and politics coverage is this like horse race coverage of who's up and who's down, and in basically every cycle in living memory, there has not nearly been enough of trying to help guide readers and audiences through what the consequences are of different propositions or people being elected into office, and sort of like help them understand what it is that they're voting for, as opposed to just saying, here's the latest polling data. And so similarly, I think that there's a lot for us to be doing in understanding what the stakes are and sort of the outcomes and consequences of a lot of this evolution, as opposed to trying to either say it is going to happen or isn't going to happen a certain way. So in my view, we're behind. We need to catch up. Can we catch up? And I'm trying to think about how to use AI. Can we use AI to catch up with where audiences are, and essentially do so that is going with the grain of consumer behavior, as opposed to trying to change the way that people work. So any innovation that you put out there, you're basically putting it somewhere on the spectrum of meeting people where they're at, or trying to get them to do something slightly different. There are ways to change people's behavior, right? So we could see policy and regulatory changes with AI that make it easier or harder for people to do things a certain way. There are obviously a lot of these efforts around news literacy. I'm curious, like in any of your high schools, were there any like news literacy classes? I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads. I don't know if I'm seeing any nodding heads, yeah. This is a thing that I feel like has kind of gone to the wayside. It like still exists, but if you need to be sort of trained on how to stay informed about things, maybe that speaks to the fact that we're not doing the work the right way, as opposed to making it so that we're putting more effort into the training piece of it. Then on the other end of it, and this is where I think we've seen a lot of the progress happen when it comes to digital product development outside of journalism, is really figuring out how to meet people where they're at, right? So there have been in fits and starts over the past decade plus now, I think these moments where journalism looks at some of the techniques that Silicon Valley uses, like design thinking, and we'll pull that in sometimes, and we'll go through some of these like tortured sessions with editors where we try to get them to think this in a way that is like very different. And it can work. I think it is generally challenging, but it's a way to start with this is with empathy, right? Of just understanding where people are and what they're doing, right? And so what we know is if we reduce how people spend their time consuming media to two very simple modes. There's essentially this like scrolling mode. You just go to TikTok or YouTube or sometimes to a news site, and you just want to be. It's a little bit more of a time wasting mode. You just want to be. You're just filling space essentially, right? And then there are other times where you're seeking out pieces of information, right? So if you think about what media companies can do in this, there are a few places where we are able to own that kind of scrolling activity, right? So that's you get somebody who's to be hooked on a podcast, and they'll build a habit around that, or they'll habitually go to open and read a newsletter or go to your app without knowing what's going to be in there, right? There's a lot that we are trying to do and can be doing more of basically just having our material be in the flow on social platforms as well. And then on the seeking side of things, there are people who will go to news apps and news sites when they're looking for a specific piece of information. But most of that has been happening through search and increasingly through these AI tools, right? So when you look at just the massive amount of time that people spend on social platforms and understanding like how we can be present on these platforms so that we're just part of that earned flow for people who are scrolling. And then, I think increasingly on the seeking side of things, understanding with this change in how people are using AI tools like ChatGPT in an information-seeking way, right? So this is even in the last year, what we've seen is essentially a doubling of people using tools like ChatGPT to get specific pieces of information, right? Some of that's current events, not all of it is. But you can even see this. So now in ChatGPT, if you turn on web search, it starts to give you trending topics, right? So they're also building for this idea that this becomes a place where you're just trying to sort of get caught up and stay caught up on things that are happening. And similarly with these AI overviews that now are at the top of many Google search results, what we're seeing is this rise of so-called like zero-click search, right? So I think the real question and challenge for us when it comes to information seeking is how do news providers find a way to be present in these experiences that are otherwise being sort of drawn, where people's answers to people's questions are being drawn further and further away from the material that we produce. So this is a huge challenge. So getting to how we start to work on that, right? If we have a better understanding of the problems of what people are seeking and what they're scrolling for, and sort of understanding what audiences want, I think that we have some good research that's been conducted over the past couple of years. This is some work that came out of Medill at Northwestern that really, in the US, Nigeria, and India, really did a deep dive into younger audiences and how they seek information, how they build relationships with creators and providers of news. And so there's this good kind of baseline research for us to work off of. And there's also the opportunity to really explore how we think more radically and differently about what's possible from a solutions perspective, right? So if we have a better understanding of what those problems are and what we're building toward, this is a moment, in my view, where we can and should be aggressively exploring how AI tools and some of these new creator tools that are usually sort of powered by or imbued with AI can be pressed into service to really meet user needs. So there's this workflow, I think we all are reasonably familiar with about story production, whether that is we're producing words or we're producing video. And I think what we're starting to see from an experimentation perspective is there are ways that we can try things out in that workflow, but I think the greater opportunity is kind of wrapping that workflow in sort of being able to look more expansively. So a way that looks is, I'll step through each of these quickly. If you think about journalism not as its own thing, but as a combination of skills and disciplines where we share intersections with other disciplines, other areas, and kind of decompose it, right? I mean, it is fact-finding, reporting, it's storytelling, it's building software and products, it's figuring out ethics. These are all things that there are other people who do similar work in other industries, right? And particularly with AI, this is a moment where people across all industries are trying to figure out what it means, right? We're not alone in any of this, right? So if we kind of figure out who our neighbors are and who's on the other side of these different intersections and understand what they are exploring, what they're trying to figure out, often part of the opportunity here is that because they are looking at some of the same problems but with a different perspective, they don't have the same baggage we do, or they have different baggage that is immaterial to us. And so this is a way to sort of understand how we can be solving problems just through that slightly different lens. One of the things that is, you look at different roles inside a news organization or different things that you care about. You're doing work at all these different intersections, but trying to scan broadly across so many of these different spaces is incredibly challenging, right? So just picking a couple and really focusing in on those, I think, is a way to kind of get more focused there. One of the techniques from innovation is just finding extreme users, right? Who are people who are doing things that are interesting, they're doing them the hard way, and they're out there, they're generally pretty prolific in what they're sharing, right? These are like alpha users, early adopters, folks like that. Just going out and finding them and just seeing what they're up to is a great way to sort of get and stay up to speed on what the sort of latest developments are that are happening in AI and other areas of emerging technology. And one of the things that I think we see is that a lot of that starts out on these sort of very open spaces, right? So if you are on Twitter or X or Blue Sky, you can sort of find these people, and often they'll, like, as these communities form, they'll stay pretty open. But they'll go deeper, right? They'll set up a Discord or a Slack or something like that, and that's where they're having more nuanced, more meaningful conversations, right? So sort of finding your tribes and being able to join these. I think one of the things that's great about journalism is that a lot of these, especially the newer ones, are very open and welcoming to people who are just starting out in their career, right? So I think the Project C community, I think like NICAR does a lot of work on this front to bring students in, people early in their career in, and make these spaces available. And what I find in this is that when you're just surrounding yourself with these folks who are trying these things out, it's relatively easy to get inspired. And if you're not getting inspired by these folks, you're probably not with the right folks. And so kind of continuing to shop around for people who are just doing interesting things is a place to sort of be able to make this work. One of the things that feels much more possible with a lot of these AI tools than with most prior sort of evolutions of media is that it is it's so possible to just like try this stuff out, right? A lot of these things are free or they're very low cost. A lot of these things can be you can kick the tires on these in minutes instead of hours. You don't need to go take 6 programming classes to be able to pull together some basic hello world kind of experience, and finding ways to get outside of the rules and constraints of journalism at least for a little while, to just try stuff out in some other aspect of your life, if you have a hobby or a passion, just to see what these things can do without immediately coming back to like, oh, is this creating synthetic material that's going to ruin society or things along those lines. Just kind of suspending that even for a little bit to understand sort of what the possibilities are, and for the people who are using these tools, what they find interesting about it and where this can go, right? And then there will be plenty of time to be really skeptical about all this stuff. There's no shortage of that. The other thing is, even if you have already built some technique or approach to doing things, a lot of these tools are so simple that it's possible to try things in unfamiliar ways, right? So I feel like this is true for people who've done a fair amount of software development, where they might be really focused on using a certain language, and now it's like you can just try stuff in completely different ways, just to kind of get out of your own habits a little bit. And similarly, as you create things, finding people who aren't journalists, right, who are civilians, and kind of getting their feedback on it, right? Those folks are closer to being the people that we try to serve, right? Journalists are really bad consumers and users of journalism. And so just kind of finding spaces where you can kind of shop this stuff around, I think is incredibly helpful. The other thing about evaluating what works and what doesn't is that because the underlying capabilities are evolving and improving so rapidly, there's plenty of stuff that doesn't work today, right? There's plenty of stuff that didn't work 6 months ago, and now it does. And so, I think one of the worst things that you can hear somebody say is like, I tried that and it didn't work. And you ask them, well, when did you try that? And they'll be like, oh, we tried that in 2012. And it's like, okay, well, the world's a little bit different now. And so I think continuing to kind of revisit some of these things that you're trying to do to see if 3 months from now it just works and things along those lines. Conversely, if something feels like it's really hard today, I think that's a great thing to put back on the shelf and just say, you know what, like if I just keep hitting a wall with this, I'm just going to put this back for now, and maybe I'll come back to this in a couple months and see if it works better. There's a lot when it comes to particularly like product development in journalism, where there's this kind of flow of you build stuff and you test it and you launch it, blah blah blah. So the idea with this is that if you're doing this kind of separate from that flow, kind of outside that flow, you can take these experiments and these explorations and plug them into what you're doing otherwise. But that, for me, it feels really important that we're creating this other space to be able to do this kind of exploration. From an industry perspective, one of the real challenges that we have today is that there's so much more of this opportunity space, and there's this need, I think, to really aggressively explore it. And we have fewer resources to be able to do this than basically we ever have before. And so I think that there's this opportunity to try a bunch of small things, and what's still kind of unexplored and what we need to figure out as a field is where we are able to and how we're able to place bigger bets on sort of some kind of like collective change. So this is still, I think we're in this incredibly challenging but also super exciting moment in this industry. Like I would say that the ability for an individual or a small number of people to do something incredibly meaningful that fits with what people want has never been greater, right? So many of these gatekeepers that existed, maybe we wanted to get jobs with those gatekeepers, those gatekeepers don't really exist in the same way anymore, right? So building that tight feedback loop of understanding like what the type of audience that you want to serve, what they need, what they want, how you can provide that, and what you can learn from them, and how you can build a community around that, I think is, the opportunity to work in that feedback loop, I think is incredibly exciting. So that's that. This is all trying to put stuff out there in trying to sort of figure out what are different ways that storytelling can and should evolve over the next 5 years or so, right? So I'm going to throw an answer at that, and then you're going to take over.
Yep.
The thing on this that I think we're just starting to see in a meaningful way is this idea of a truly like personal assistant, right? So, going back, if you were an executive, you'd have a personal assistant, and in some places they would put together like news clips for you and all that kind of stuff. You know, ChatGPT a couple weeks ago launched this, essentially this like morning briefing type thing, Pulse, right? So if you pay them a lot of money each month for their top plan, it'll be like, I worked all night and I can, figured out these things for you and all of that. I think what we're starting to see and what we'll see over the next couple of years is that that's going to get easier and easier and lower cost, so that more of us can and should have these agents that are essentially out there all day, every day, trying to find the information that we need and anticipating what it is that we are going to need, and essentially doing a lot of that work for us. And when you think about the design of those systems and those approaches and what they're relying on, I think that there are sort of two really interesting things for us to figure out as an industry. One is in the design of those themselves, right? If you think about the principles of journalism and how it can be applied to that in terms of that information being of high quality, that information being sort of like what you need in the moment. There's whether or not you can think of that agent as being of doing journalism itself, it's essentially kind of becoming like a little automated reporter for you. How can we be involved in the creation of those types of systems? And then in addition to that, as we are creating a lot of the raw materials that those types of systems use, how can we be making sure that we're essentially providing more of the information that we've collected so that it can be plugged into these systems in more meaningful ways. So if you think about, you spend 2 weeks on this massive reporting project, right? And then what historically we'd have to do is you'd have to cut that down. You create one synthesis of it, you leave about 95% of the material you collected in your reporter's notebook or on the cutting room floor, and the world never had access to it, right? And now, I think what we're starting to see is that we can provide more of that material, not to drown people in information, but to provide all of that to these systems that can then go figure out that like the 5% that you need is different from the 5% that you need, and be able to provide much more sort of personalized guidance based on that. So when we think about the outputs of what news organizations are creating and putting out there every day, it feels like it's not only possible but to our collective benefit for us to be thinking about putting a greater share of the information that we collect out into the world in some way, shape, or form, on the expectation that some system will come along and essentially match that up with what people need, so that they get the right information at the right times. And we don't have to always be thinking about this like perfect reader and what they know and don't know and what needs to be explained and what to put in the B matter because maybe they're not up to date on this story and things like that. Like in some ways I think it takes some of the load off of us of having to try to predict who exactly that person is and what they need. So that's, I think in a lot of ways exciting because it means we can just be putting more stuff out there based on the work that we're doing today. So with that, you want to
we'll do a microphone
take
switch?
On? Yeah.
Great, thanks so much.
All right, who are your victims?
Yes. How's this work? Working?
Yep.
Okay. All right. All right. There it goes. Goodbye. Okay. All right. Thanks. So thanks very much, Mark. He's really teed things up, especially when it comes to technology. It's clear that however AI evolves, we'll get a personal assistant, we'll have many assistants, however that goes, we'll see. But we know that's developing, it's going to make us really empower us in doing storytelling. What I wanted to talk about now and get ideas from the speakers and from you is what is storytelling going to look like as it evolves over the next 5 years. I begin with a couple of principles, whether I'm right or not, we'll find out. One is it's all going to have to do with a mobile phone, and it's all going to be streaming. This could be wrong, and maybe it's provocative. I think there'll be many other ways the information comes along, but where it starts will be there. And the more we think that we're going to produce stories that start there, because that's where people start with news, the better chance we'll have with working with our audience, with whoever our community is. So I'd say to start with those two basic things. A third thing is I think we're going to become more and more visual. I think we'll need to be thinking about videos and AR and VR and things. We all respond much better to video being out there. A fourth thing I've been thinking about, which is actually going back in history to new journalism, is I think it's going to be more personal, and we're going to share more of the journey of the story with whoever we're talking to, in whatever way we're conveying the information. In other words, we're telling people about the process, how we found it out. We can see that happening already. I went here and I talked to so-and-so. That's certainly been an audio approach to things, but I think in many ways we're going to be sharing how we got the information to establish more credibility. If you want an example of where I think some things are going, I don't know if anyone, ask for a raise of hands. How many people looked at, say, the New York Times visual investigations? Has anybody looked at that? A few people. I highly recommend going there. It is open source intelligence. That means they're gathering up social media for what they're doing. They're getting documents. They're doing interviews. It's a production, but it's also very compelling production because it engages you in so many different ways. And it also explains, those investigations explain how they're doing the investigation. And their framework is very chronological. But every time I've shown one of these investigations to a group, people are generally pretty riveted to whatever's being shown. But I went to start and ask Chris Ball, who's here from the University of Illinois, does VR, AR training. How do you think that storytelling is going to evolve over the next few years?
Sure. I'll get more into it in my talk in a little while, so it's a good plug for
Yes.
that. But I think over the next 5 years, journalism as well as many other industries will become much more experiential. So we kind of demarcate time in terms of industrial age, and we've been living through the information age. And people have started to posit, well, maybe what's next is like the experiential age. Immersive technologies like augmented and virtual reality will undoubtedly play a role in that, but also the personalization that you're mentioning. The ability to tailor information, make it more engaging and more experiential over time with some of these new tools. And I'm also interested to see, maybe not in 5 years, maybe in 10, how our phone might evolve into something more like glasses. And then that information is with us in a very different way. So a lot of interesting sort of challenges coming, but also a lot of interesting opportunities to think about what does media creation look like, what does journalism look like as these changes hit.
David, what do you think?
I mean, what comes to my mind, harkening back to some of the stuff that Mark was also talking about, and when I gave a talk yesterday, I mentioned this, like the old joke of the two young fish and an old fish. The old fish says, "Nice water we got today," and then swims by, and then one fish turns to the other one and says, "What the hell is water?" And the idea of everything being so personalized, I think increasingly storytelling is going to be a non-stop thing. It is going to be the water that we are swimming in. We're going to be inundated with storytelling. We're doing it already. Like, if you think about memes, everything from a TikTok dance to anything else, they kind of have a narrative arc to them. And you're not constantly thinking about that. It's not like watching a movie for 2 hours straight. But over the course of a week, you might actually spend 2 hours worth of time consuming that meme during its narrative arc. And you're doing that across 50 different memes or TikTok themes or whatever, right? So we're constantly jumping in and out of different stories at different times. And I think that's both, interesting. There's a part of me that's interested and excited about that as people in the storytelling business. But I also, again, I worry about our ability to understand the temperature. How's the water today, right? What's water, right? That's just me, how I exist now. I'm in and out of stories non-stop all the time. So it's both a media literacy thing, to the point earlier, but also I think the future of it is our ability to manage these arcs that people can dip in and out of super quickly as they need.
Okay. Anybody else? Damon?
real briefly on that, I want to come back to, I agree with all of these changes in technology are happening, the way we experience the news, but like the news hasn't changed, how it's relevant to us hasn't changed, and I'm real concerned about the atomization of storytelling, especially across different platforms, changes the way we understand the meta-narrative of the community. You're hearing it in different bits and pieces, it's not a coherent narrative, so when you lose that gatekeeping of the editor, you lose the coherence potentially of the story as well. And at the local level, like that story is the important piece. That's not our argument against the tech at all, but it's a concern about how do we actually maintain the coherence.
So is the gatekeeper more the credible aggregator?
So I definitely call gatekeepers, in the digital age, I call them curators.
You call them what?
Curators. So it's an
Curators,
efficiency
yeah.
as opposed to a ivory tower perspective. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, okay, any other comments?
Yeah, I think in the next 5 years we'll see more of a premium on storytellers with like a personal connection, I guess, to the stories they're telling, on people telling stories from like within the story itself and from the outside. And I can see that having a real effect on reporting and how, and the types of stories we choose to tell, not just like looking from the outside in, but getting involved and kind of documenting from the inside.
Okay, yeah. Anyone in the audience, is there a particular form of news storytelling that's attracting you at this point? Like, is it something off TikTok? Is it something podcast? Is there any kind of storytelling that's really attractive? Nobody's jumping in, Anthony? Is there a particular one that you find attractive, kind of storytelling?
Was that me? Sorry.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't hear my name. So I would say, just going off what he said, the authenticity thing I think is key, right? So like, I think this authenticity of connecting with the individual, because I mean, the younger generation here, even myself, I'm 47, like the older ways of telling stories like TV news, it doesn't resonate with a lot of people. So the authenticity is key. But I would also say, like, in terms of storytelling, I'm a little concerned because the audience is so fragmented now, and the attention spans, I should talk about actually, that they are impatient to get the information they need, right? So like, if we're trying to build a narrative, you have to really get them off the first couple seconds quickly because they're so impatient, right? So like, you really have to get them into off the top to keep pulling them in. But that concerns me in terms of the attention span, because like, even if you take the layout of any type of story, it's like, if you're burying what the lead is in the information, that can be really frustrating for an audience member. So I guess like, even in my class, as I'm thinking through like how we construct narrative stories, it's like, is the audience going to be patient enough to wait for that narrative to unfold, particularly when they want, hopefully at some point they're looking for meaningful information that gives them the nuts and bolts and the key points of like, what's the point of this story, what's the point of it. So that like has made me reevaluate and restructure even like how we outline web stories, right? It's like, even with a narrative web story, is really someone going to wait to back in to get to the nut graph? So thinking about key points off the top and things that they can pull out off the top that give them the main points, so they don't have to wait to get that in an actual narrative article.
Yeah, Damon, go over here, yeah.
Real quick reaction to that. It's really interesting you're seeing on TikTok creators who are already adapting to the financial incentives of the platform by like giving a little introduction and then saying something and then like drawing out the middle and then giving at the end, because there's whatever the minute and a half or something it is to monetize most effectively. So like, they're already being distorted by the financial incentives, even though they're authentic, original, sort of human, as opposed to journalists. Human, like real people doing this creation, but they're also reacting to the same pressures traditional journalism is. It's interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
I guess I'd also, just to chime in on some of what's being said, I think that the story, you have to find them in the first place. It comes to you. It's not, people on TikTok aren't seeking you out, it's coming to them. So how do you construct stories that grab attention, but also get into people's feeds, get it into where they are. And so, because, if you're under 30 on TikTok, you're not seeking out news, but you're getting it as a result of, and as a result of being on the platform, and it's coming to you. So it's like a multi-part. Sure, you can tell this great story, but if no one's going to see it because it's not getting, it's not getting where they are, then that's another factor in thinking about. I think your point about the impatience, that you got to get there first. They have to actually consume it. Be in front of you or in a position to consume.
Yeah. I think that's where knowing the algorithms is key, even though they're ever changing.
Yeah.
NPR, I think, in fact, someone had recently a really interesting podcast or a section of it about the algorithms and just the voice and the intonation in, I think they were looking at influencers in particular, how that can impact the algorithms. Look at that, and they use that to push it further in feeds or higher up. And there was a whole discussion about just the voice you use in your videos on social media.
That's crazy.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to say something about the idea of subject matter experts, because I think we do go to these types of people because they have the expertise, they know what they're talking about. But let me give you an example of how this cannot work. I worked at a newspaper that 15 years ago put subject matter experts into the newsroom. And I would have a discussion with the SME for education. And I'd ask him what his goal was, and his was to explain to the public the things that he thought they needed to know about education. My question for him was, what is the communication method for the public communicating to you what they think about education? He did not have a plan for it because he only thought that his job was to explain the thing that the public didn't understand that he did. And so I think we still need these moderators, editors, so to speak, to come in and be an advocate for the audience to get that information out, and that's editing. The evolution of storytelling, I think that people are going to try to be the curators and editors. I love reading a good story, and I think a lot of people will. But also there are people who want metadata, and they're going to call it up on whatever they want. I will tell you that today, Vital is getting a 9.9 overall score for their $85 smart glasses, where it will translate for you foreign languages. It will deliver news to your head. It will take pictures and videos. All of these things with a pair of really ugly looking glasses, but they're utile. So I think we're going to have a lot of battles over the next 5 years over who's the curator, who's the editor, and who's going to provide that information in a way that is trustworthy, even if it's coming from a subject matter expert.
Yeah. Any comments?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, no pressure. I think about what you just said about who's the curator. I think, depending on the number of people in this room, everybody curates their own, right? Like, and when you have these wonderful phones that we've had in our pockets, they're basically tiny computers, we're all kind of curating our own sources and how we distribute and understand information. One of my favorite things to do is actually, and professionally, is like user research, where you just ask people like, hey, how do you use your phone? And in talking to people, you see how different they understand what news is. And I'm sure half the people in this room would be like, oh, I get news from TikTok, right? And then people who are older like me would be like, I don't really do that. I go to the newspaper app. But everybody has a different way of how they're going to do it. And I think in these next few years, right, we're just going to move into a space where everyone is kind of, everybody is kind of right now curating their own.
Well, I think the key is dogs and cats. I think so long as we've got dogs and cats, I think the story. I think.
Apparently pitches the video,
What's that?
how your video is pitched.
Yeah, that's right.
How they're saying that in dogs and cats.
Yeah. Any other comments on this? Yeah, Gary.
I think audiences are going to be moving are accelerating the move toward stories that have personality and voice, and a move away from just the facts and a straight, what we would call objective story. And so I think that that means a lot more opinion and analysis will be read, but will it be presented as opinion and analysis? Will people realize it's opinion and analysis? And I think people will be reading more stuff about more stuff, but I wonder who's going to be providing the basis for that, the facts upon which that's all based.
I think we want to close this part off. I know people have to go to class and there'll be another session coming up soon. But I'd like to suggest that people go back and look at what was called the new journalism. Hunter Thompson, Tom Wolfe, people like that. A long time ago in the early 60s, there was this whole thing to personalize news. The New Yorker and other magazines took this on. So the reporter, author, whatever, takes you along on the journey and tells you what they think of who they're meeting, what their reaction was, and it really changed news in a major way that we could approach it and put ourselves in the news story. And now people can do that. The news we're getting out of Portland or Chicago or people right in the middle of it, including journalists. And that's just, we have the ability to basically do what we used to call live TV now. And we're in the midst of it. Everyone has that possibility. What we haven't talked about is all the AI news and false news that we're going to get, and how we're going to combat that, and how our storytelling will differ from that. Because certainly those who are pushing false news forward, I have to acknowledge they can tell a pretty good story. It just happens to be totally made up and totally sensational, and but that's something you really need to think about how to combat that. And maybe part of it is, we've seen this started to happen, particularly with comics. Look at, this absolute piece of crap news that has no thing in reality, and we're going to make total fun of it while we're doing it. So I would say one of the evolutions I'll see over the next few years is more humor. I think everybody's going to get a better sense of humor, because it's the only way to really deal with this. But for people that have not heard of new journalism or Tom Wolfe or Hunter Thompson, I would highly suggest taking a look at it, because it tells you, they basically told you how to have personality while you're doing the news. It's really good. Any other comments? Yeah.
So when you guys talk about like ChatGPT and the evolution of storytelling, is it like more helpful for journalism, or is it like more hurtful towards like the jobs of journalists in the future? Like, will it take more jobs? Like, will it help you guys more expand on it?
I think my initial reaction to AI and ChatGPT, and by the way, you should know about Claude. A lot of us like Claude better, right? We keep saying ChatGPT. I can see a lot of potential on what Mark just said, the personal assistant. Okay, they're prompted to go out and do the grunt work. And I think a lot of people were affronted of AI initially, but quite frankly, some of the reporting we did over the years was very AI. Copy, paste, only the names change, the numbers change, we're just doing this formula, I'm fine with that. So far, I'm sure they'll get better. I don't find AI writing is compelling. It's a human being. I can tell an AI memo, essay, pretty fast. It's generic. It refers to things I know the person that was writing it had never seen, or anything like that. But I think it'll be able to generate really bad journalism for sure. So I think, we've got two things going on. How to use these tools better, how to make them work for us, and then at the same time, how to combat, the slop, as Mark would call it, that just kind of pours out of them. It's sort of the difference between real wrestling and professional wrestling, right? Other comments, other things? I just wanted to tee it up. We've got some really good speakers for the rest of the afternoon. Yes, yeah.
I have one comment on the jobs. Could it be that, with the rise of AI, it could create a whole new class of jobs, of, people that manage the information. They're jobs that don't exist today, but because of AI and because of the need to manage, like, so we're talking about these vast amounts of information. Mark was talking about, putting all the stuff out there. Well, someone has to, there's got to be, someone has to be the gatekeeper of that information, or, who is watching over what's going into your LLM or whatever. But I do think that, in a lot of industries that's changing, right? These the jobs are shifting, and so, I think that one thing to think about is in, the journalism industry, how could that manifest?
Well, I'm already thinking that we're developing and being trained to be good prompters, right? We're just
Prompters, but just managing the...
right, but that'll be part of managing.
Correct.
I would recommend everybody. I'm not sure if it's going to be in hard copy or when it'll be in hard copy, but there's a column by, I think it's Stephen Witt, who's written a book about AI, has a column out today about the people trying to put guardrails on AI and what they can or can't do, and
Right.
is AI going to set off a nuclear bomb one day or whatever. He's not sensational how he writes about it, but I was reading also, like, okay, that's happening at this high corporate funded level of how we figure out what's real, what's not, and how we train it and so forth. But I'm already finding people that are better at interacting with AI and getting better information. I mean, how many people have been playing with that? Everybody? Yeah, and I mean, there's a learning curve there just to get it to move forward, It's also terribly inconsistent. Like, I just ran an experiment last year trying to get something that was on the web, summarized, put it into a different format. First time I did it, happened in 2 minutes. Next time, and I like to go back and do it 3 times. Next time, I was having an argument with AI for 30 minutes. Then the next morning I went by, tried it again, it was 5 minutes. So I think there's this skill level, and if you're going to be gatekeeper or whatever, curator of this stuff, you're really gonna have to know how it works and how it's evolving. So I think there's a combination of things we need to do. But it's a good point. It's, aggregators, curators, arguments, we're just finding out on this. But I do suggest that you do take a look at this column by Stephen Witt in his book. Now I'm going to pick up his book. He did the whole thing on AI and evolution, recent evolution of AI. So maybe take a break, Kevin, on this, and then we'll reconvene at 2.
2 o'clock?
Yep, okay. Great, thanks.
Okay.